So welcome everyone. We're going to be continuing on with our this recent series, and today we're going to be working with Subpart H. So if any of you attended last week's Subpart M, you'll see that a lot of our material is the same, but where we have differences is based on the activity that you're undertaking, you then fall under different subparts of the lead-safe housing rule. And so as we go through this, you'll be seeing that what the requirements are specific to things like the level of evaluation, the treatment, follow-up, ongoing maintenance are going to be different based on the subpart that you are going to be covered by. So full title of this is the lead-based paint poisoning prevention in certain residential structures, but we're simply going to be talking about the lead-safe housing rule and today focusing on Subpart H. So let's start with some brief introduction. So first off, I want to introduce Chris Richmond, my co-trainer here. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Richmond. I've been with ICF for about 24 years now. I do a lot of work with the lead-safe housing rule, also with the HOME program, the new HOME ARP program, and Section 3. So happy to be here with you today. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And I'm Les Warner. I've been with ICF for 15 years. Work with HOME and the CDBG and lead-safe housing rule, Section 3, URA, and some disaster work. And prior to joining ICF, I worked at the state level. I headed a state program, worked at the state level for 20 years. We're also really lucky to be joined by a crew from HUD's Office of Healthy Homes. And so we've got Bruce Haber, Flora Chavez, and Barrett Fisher on with us today, and they're going to be helping us as we're fielding questions, and we may turn to their expertise as we move along here. So let's talk just a little bit about what we're trying to do as part of this survey. So we want to make sure that folks have a good understanding of the lead-based paint regulations that would apply. We're going to be introducing some key terms so that you understand as we use these terms throughout the training that you understand what we mean by that. And then we'll be talking about, well, how do you figure out which subpart is triggered by the activity that we're undertaking? Chris will actually walk us through the subparts a little bit later in this, but again, today we're going to be focusing on Subpart H, which is specific to project-based assistance. As part of that, we're going to be talking about, what does the subpart require you to do? What are the key steps in evaluation and treating the hazards, things like notification, ongoing maintenance. But we're also going to be then highlighting, so what documentation should you have in your files? What's the process as you go along? And as part of that, we'll be pointing out there are a lot of available resources, sample tools, things that you don't have to reinvent. They're available for you. In some cases can be then borrowed and tweaked a little bit to work well with your program that you're operating. So we'll make sure at the end of this that you're familiar with those resources and know where to find them as part of that. So for today, we have 3 hours. We generally have been using pretty much all of that. And then tomorrow we have a 1-hour session that is available for you. And this is, we are going to start with going over an exercise. So we have an exercise that was part of the packet that you received with the training materials. And what the exercise does is essentially test your understanding of the materials that we're covering. So it's a good way to check and see, have I captured those important details? Am I ready to be able to implement those? So we'll first go through that and talk about the answers to the exercise and those key concepts. But we'll also then have some additional time for any questions you bring to that session. And we'll also do a little review of some of the questions that came up in today's session that maybe need a little more time to those. I also want to mention that this session and the rest of them in the series are being recorded, and they will be available. They'll be posted on the HUD Exchange we'll be showing you where on the HUD Exchange to find those. And so that, if you have other staff that you would have liked to have participated in this training, those are going to be available for you. They also would be a resource to be able to refer back to. So for the series offering, we're now on our second session in the series, as I mentioned, talking about Subpart H, which is for project-based assistance. We do have one more session coming up next week, focusing on Subpart L, which is the public housing requirements. Registration is separate for each one of these, so if you wanted to participate or you had others that needed to participate in next week's session, they would need to register for that. I'll also mention, as part of the packet that was sent out, I already mentioned that there's the exercise for tomorrow, but we have a number of things within that which we think will be helpful reference tools for you. There is a lead-safe housing rule definition handout which walks you through all these key definitions that we're going to be talking about throughout today's session. There also is a handout about the disclosure requirements under the lead-safe housing rule, and Chris is going to be covering those a little bit later. We will in this session not only be talking about the lead-safe housing rule, but also the EPA's renovation, repair, and painting rule. And we have a handout that kind of walks you through the details of the EPA rule versus the lead-safe housing rule. We'll also talk about that in today's session. And then there's also a summary of lead-based paint that's part of that. And you'll see we'll be looking at the handout, which walks you through the regulations for this particular subpart, and we'll be introducing that as we go along in this. So since we're not together in a room and can't kind of go around and get to know each other a little bit, we do want to do a poll question just to try to learn a bit about the folks that are participating in today's session. So looks like Sharita has the poll open for you. And so we're asking, how experienced are you with the lead regulations? And then you have options of, I'm new to the regulations, or I have some experience, or I have quite a bit of experience in performing the key steps in that. So if you would go ahead and vote, click on one of those options, and then click on the Submit button. Those will be tabulated for us, and we'll get a little bit of a feel for the mix of folks in the room today. All right, poll is ended. So we'll get the tabulation of the entries on that in just a minute. All right, so we've got kind of a predicted mix, I think, of the folks that respond to this, kind of a half and half between new to this versus with some experience. We have a few folks with more expertise. So we're going to be going through all of the basics on this. Let me get this poll closed down on my screen. There we go. Okay. So we want to start out by kind of walking through the lead-safe housing rule basics. And first off, we're going to talk a little bit about, what is lead? Why are we concerned about this? So as you probably realize, lead is a naturally occurring element. Of course, things like arsenic, other things are also naturally occurring. And we would find that in our environment and air, soil, and water. But we also have, within that, we have lead that has been introduced into that environment through manufacturing or other products. So, things like paint, industrial facilities, pipes. Up until the late 70s, we also were using lead in our fuel. So our combustion engines were producing fumes that included lead. And then we have things like ceramics and other products, batteries, cosmetics that might include lead. And so it is something that's in our environment. And what we're concerned about is that children are the most vulnerable to this. And so we're wanting to make sure that, that we are controlling that exposure in their homes. So lead has been around, it's been in paint since prior to the 1800s. It was a popular ingredient in paint because it added to the durability, the pigmentation as part of that, and it also helped as a drying agent. So it was, the lead paint was sort of naturally resistant to mildew, held up really well, and so it was used extensively, particularly for exteriors, but also for bathrooms and kitchens. Now, luckily, lead was banned in residential paint in 1978. And that was banned by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. So you'll hear us talking as we go through this training about our focus is on pre-1978 units. That's because starting in 1978, the use of paint that included lead was banned, and so we would expect not to find that in these units. So, as I mentioned, the highest risk group that we're trying to protect are children that are under the age of 6. They're in a high growth mode. They are absorbing, their bodies are absorbing more lead than we would see in an adult, and so they are more at risk on that. We'll talk about some of the ways that they also might accidentally ingest the lead. In that same high-risk group would also be pregnant women. So because if they are exposed to lead and it's in their blood, it then is passed on or exposed to that developing child. And so we, as we talk about occupancy of units, we'll be talking about children under 6, also with pregnant women, because of that risk to that. Also, as part of what we're going to be talking about in safe work practices, we're concerned about workers in either construction or industrial settings who have a high exposure to lead because of the work that they're doing. And so not only will we want to be talking about in training and how work is being done in protecting that worker, but we also want to make sure that they are not essentially bringing that contamination home to us or contaminating other parts of the structure that they're working on, which then leads to others being at risk from that. So let's talk a little bit about how children actually get exposed to lead. So children are going to have a lot of hand, especially really young children, are going to have a lot of hand-to-mouth action, but they also may be crawling around playing on outside in soils that have contamination, or on floors where we have a buildup of lead dust that might be from friction surfaces like doors and windows, other impact surfaces that are generating lead dust and debris. And then there is also the possibility that if we have unstable painted surfaces, which we'll be talking about as we go through this, that there's the potential that the child would ingest those paint chips that are chipping away from those surfaces. And so you'll hear us talk about, as we go through our evaluation, we're looking for these key points of exposure on this. So the impact on children is that it can impact the development of their brain. And so lower IQ could be causing things like hearing loss or other disabilities. It could have an impact on the proper development of their body, including bone and muscle structure on that, but also then damaging organs, causing things like anemia for the child. So when we talk about what the trigger level is for lead in a child, we're talking about 5 micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood. And so Chris is going to be talking about late in this training about when we are dealing with a child with an elevated blood lead level, and they're essentially looking at that micrograms of lead per deciliter of blood to make that determination whether we have a child with an elevated blood lead level. I'll just mention at the bottom of this training or this slide, we have a link here for a video, which I think if you've not seen it before might be really interesting for folks. It really kind of goes into the science of how the blood makes that impact on the body, and I would recommend that if you've not seen it, take a look at it. It also may be helpful if you're trying to pass on information to staff or recipients, that this link I think folks will find useful and very approachable. So the lead-safe housing rule was put in place, and it's really to protect children who are living in assisted, targeted housing. And when we talk about targeted housing, that's housing that was constructed prior to 1978, since we know that use of lead in paint was banned in 1978. So it targeted those units built prior to that period. And our primary goal here is to prevent that exposure to lead hazards. So we're going to be talking about there are some exemptions for housing that is specifically set aside for elderly persons with disabilities. We're going to be talking about zero-bedroom units. And so I kind of hold that conversation till we specifically get to that. So let's talk about our exemptions. So we said that our focus on this is going to be assisted targeted housing. So those properties that are constructed after January 1st of 1978 are going to be exempt. So part of your process is determining the unit, the assisted unit that you're dealing with, when was it actually constructed. You may have units in your portfolio that are built on or after January 1st of 1978, and so they're going to be exempt from this rule. Also exempted would be where we have zero-bedroom units, or what we call single-room occupancy units. And I think the thought here is because they are zero-bedroom units, we're not really expecting to have children occupying those units. But, and you'll notice there's an asterisk here, if we have a zero-bedroom unit or SRO, but we have a child under 6 years old that is residing in that unit or is expected to reside. So when we talk about expected to reside in a dwelling unit, that means that we have a lease that has been signed, and so we know the household that is going to be moving in, and we know that that household includes a child under the age of 6, or also when we have a pregnant woman in that household, and so we're expecting that there's going to be a child under 6 that's going to be added to that household. So in those cases where we have that at-risk child, then that exemption for those units goes away. We similarly have an exclusion on this for units that are specifically set aside for the elderly or persons with disabilities. So it's not just that we happen to have a unit that is occupied by the elderly or disabled, but that these units have been set aside and restricted to be specifically for elderly and disabled individuals. And again, if in those restricted units we still end up having a child under the age of 6 occupying or expected to occupy, then that exemption is going to go away because we have a child at risk that's going to occupy that unit. You also might have units that you'd be working with that were built prior to 1978, but they've been tested and inspected and determined that they don't have any lead-based paint. So, it was in production until the ban went in place and used for residential, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the property does actually include lead-based paint. In some cases, you also could have properties that originally had lead-based paint, and it has all been removed, and we have clearance that's been achieved as part of that. So to utilize this exemption, you would need to have that documentation in place as the basis for why your property is exempt from those requirements. Some other exemptions, I don't know that we would see this in a project-based assistance model. But if we had an unoccupied property that was going to be demolished and it was going to be kept unoccupied, then we don't need to deal with the lead-safe housing rule on that. Also, if we had a situation, an emergency of some kind, let's say there was a tornado and a portion of the roof had been torn off from this property, the emergency action that you would be taking to stabilize that property would be exempt from needing to go through the requirements of the lead-safe housing rule. But that's just the emergency action on this. So, maybe we've tarped it, we've done something to stabilize that structure, but we are going to come back and do a restoration or rehab to fix that damage. That portion of the work that we're doing would have to be in compliance with the requirements of the lead-safe housing rule. It's just the emergency action that is exempted from that. Also, some things that we might be doing that would be exempted from the lead-safe work practices and clearance requirements. If we were doing some kind of maintenance or repair activity that didn't actually disturb any painted surfaces. So, maybe we are switching out, putting in a new water heater for a unit. If we're not disturbing any painted surfaces, we don't have to follow the lead-safe work practices that we're going to be talking about a little bit later, and you wouldn't be required to then have clearance done as part of that. We also have a provision within the lead-safe housing rule, and I'll just point out, we'll mention this again later, these are different than the EPA's regulations. But in cases where we have a really limited work area, we have these de minimis exemptions. So if we're working on less than or 2 square feet or less of interior space, and so maybe that's components of woodwork or something that we're working on, or 10% of a small component type, or if we're working on the exterior and we're at 20 square feet for exterior work or less, then these are exempt from having to follow the lead-safe work practices and getting clearance on that. Now, it's recommended that we use lead-safe work practices at all times, but we do have flexibility in those limited cases where we have a much more smaller area of work. All right, so I'm going to turn things over to Chris at this point.
Great, thanks, Les. All right, so now we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about the regulations. So there are 2 federal regulations that we're going to discuss today. The first is HUD's regulations. Those are found at 24 CFR Part 35. And then we have EPA's regulations, which are found at 40 CFR Part 745. And if you're new to regulation, CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations, and you are always going to find HUD regulations at Title 24, and you'll always find EPA regulations at Title 40. So first off, we're going to look at HUD's regulations, and you'll see this yellow arrow here. We have our lead disclosure rule. And the lead disclosure rule is actually identical to EPA's lead disclosure rule. They're word for word identical, but we have both of those listed there for you to see. And so we're going to go over what disclosure is in a little bit. And then we have, back in the HUD regulations, we have Subpart B, where we're talking about the general lead-safe housing rule requirements and the definitions. And then you'll see we have Subpart H. This is the one that we're going to be focusing on. This is where it talks about what needs to be followed. What do you need to do to be in compliance for Subpart H, project-based assistance, for the lead-safe housing rule. And you'll see we have this similar arrow down here for EPA for D, L, and Q. And so under the EPA regulations, it's who can do that kind of work? What are the standards for performing lead-based abatement, risk assessment, the inspections? So they kind of go hand in hand. That's why we have those 2 arrows on there. And then we have Subpart R, our Lead Safe Housing Rule methods and standards, and this is covering the how. How is an evaluation done, how is hazard reduction done, how is it carried out, and who can do it. And then going back down again to our EPA regulations, we already mentioned the disclosure rule and the levies paying activities, and we have subparts E and Q. This is our renovation, repair, and painting rule, or you'll hear Les and I refer to this as the RRP rule. And so the RRP rule really minimizes exposure to dust, and it emphasizes safe work practices. We have a handout that Les is going to go over that compares what the RRP requirements are to the HUD rules and how we're going to overlap those together. So that previous slide, really just listed out what the regulations were. This slide's going to give us a little more details about it. So we have on the left-hand side here, HUD's EPA lead disclosure rule. Like I told you, this is HUD Subpart A and EPA Subpart F, and it's for both assisted and non-assisted housing. So all housing, public and private, built before 1978. This has been in effect for a really long time now, since March of 1996, except for the exemptions that Les mentioned earlier. This disclosure rule is enforced by both HUD, EPA, and the Department of Justice. And then we have our lead safe housing rule. This is the one that we're going to be focusing on today. This applies to almost all federally assisted and federally owned housing built before 1978. This has been in effect since September of 2000, so 23 years now, almost 23 years it's been in effect. It's enforced by HUD. And then we have on the right-hand side in our yellow box here, EPA's renovation, repair, and painting rule. And this is for any renovation or repair or painting project that's done by a contractor that disturbs paint in pre-1978 homes, child cares, and preschools. So you'll see both target housing, that's housing built before 1978, public and private. It's a little more expanded on what it covers. So you'll see here it's housing and child-occupied facilities such as schools and daycare centers, whereas HUD's rule is really focusing on housing. HUD's rule is not looking at child cares or preschools. And the EPA rule is enforced by EPA in some states. All right, so the Lead Safe Housing Rule covers multiple activities. Today we are focusing on Subpart H, project-based assistance. You will see that we're also going to be discussing Subpart A, disclosure. Like I said, we're going to cover Subpart H, and then we're also going to be looking at Subpart R, what are the methods and the standards for following that. If for some reason you were doing this is project-based assistance, but if you were doing any type of tenant-based assistance, that's Subpart M. And we talked about Subpart M last week, and if that's what you showed up today hoping to hear, we're talking about project-based assistance, not tenant-based assistance. And that recording will be posted if it's not up already. We did do this training several months ago, so there is the past recording of Subpart M. But today we're going to be focusing on Subpart H, project-based assistance. So project-based assistance, or you'll see it listed as PBA on a lot of our slides here, it provides federal rental assistance that's tied to a specific property or a specific location, and it remains at that location throughout the term of the assistance. And project-based assistance follows Subpart H of the Lead Safe Housing Rule. So you'll see some of the programs that this covers: project-based rental assistance, project-based vouchers, also other types of project-based assistance that you might find in HOPWA, the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, or Continuum of Care, or Shelter Plus Care programs, or multifamily housing programs. This is not an all-inclusive list, so if you are running a project-based assistance and you're not sure if your program is affected, you want to check with your HUD office. And as I mentioned, if you are administering housing choice vouchers, that follows Subpart M TBRA. So today we are focusing on project-based assistance, where that voucher or that rental assistance is actually tied to a particular unit. So we do have a definition handout. I'm going to bring that up for you just in case you weren't aware that it's there. I know that Sharita put into the chat the link to be able to access these materials. So for some reason you didn't see that email today, or you weren't sure what the link was for, it's for all of the different handouts. It has the slides and it has this definition handout as well. But a couple of the key definitions that I want us to focus on. The first one's target housing. You've seen this in a number of the slides already. Les talked about it. Target housing is housing that's built before 1978 with some exceptions. And those exceptions are housing exclusively for the elderly, housing exclusively for the disabled, or zero-bedroom units, unless a child under the age of 6 is residing or expected to reside in the unit. Another key definition that you're going to hear us talk about quite often is lead-based paint hazards. And so any condition that causes exposure from deteriorated paint or dust with lead levels at or above the dust lead hazard standard, or soils with lead levels at or above the dust soil hazard standard, or friction, impact, or chewable surfaces, that's what we consider to be lead-based paint hazards. So any condition that causes exposure from these items that would result in an adverse human effect. That's what we refer to as lead-based paint hazards. And then we have lead-based paint. So lead-based paint is any paint or other surface coatings that contain lead that's equal to or exceeding 1 milligram per square centimeter. So some states and communities have more stringent definitions of lead-based paint. There's a more that some of these states or cities might have a more protective standard of what they consider lead-based paint. So right now, HUD has set their standard at 1 milligram per square centimeter. But you want to check with your state and local regulatory authority to see if there are any stricter requirements for that definition in your area. And as I mentioned, these definitions do show up on the handout, and here's the link as well. Right, so the Lead Safe Housing Rule uses the term designated party. You'll hear us refer to designated party a lot more often when we get into the section that discusses elevated blood lead level children, EBLL. And this is the person or the entity that's responsible for responding to the Lead Safe Housing Rule requirements for the assistance to a particular housing property or unit. And when we're dealing with Subpart H, the designated party is the owner. So there are many key professionals involved with housing and helping to meet compliance with the Lead Safe Housing Rule. You have your owners and managers. That could include your in-house inspections and your maintenance personnel, someone who's taking all of the, who's doing the maintenance and the repair, perhaps someone doing the applications. We have our program staff. We may have inspectors on our program staff, our compliance staff, and then there are going to be times where we may need to call in lead specialists. So we may need to hire a paint inspector or a risk assessor or a clearance examiner. We may have to have work that needs to be performed, and so our owners might need to hire RRP workers to do that work, or if they decide to do abatement, they might need to hire lead abatement supervisors and contractors. So these are all just the different professionals that are involved with this. When we get into the different modules, Les is going to go over and explain what some of these different specialists are, how you can find these specialists, and what kind of training and what they can do. So in 2021, the EPA announced its intent to improve compliance and strengthen enforcement of RRP. Remember, RRP is that renovation, repair, and painting rule. And so they really want to strengthen that how it applies to property management firms and companies that perform, offer, or claim to perform regulated renovations without certification from EPA in RRP. So in order to do any type of work that's above de minimis, we need to be trained in RRP. And so HUD and EPA has started to see some of these property managers doing this maintenance work without having the proper RRP training in place. So they did put out a memo that they are going to start to enforce this a little more. We do have the link here if you do want to review that. So the management company is being held responsible for meeting the RRP rules even if they contract out that duty. So this slide is going to show us some of the key steps in lead-based paint compliance process. I'm going to go over a lot of information in the next two slides, and I don't want you to freak out. We are going to be going over it in a lot more detail, but we just want to talk about some of the key steps. And the key steps you'll see, disclose and look and treat, and that's how we're going to be thinking about going through these different steps. So first, we're going to start off with disclosure. We have a couple slides that will go a little more into detail about this, but this is where the owner is disclosing any information they know about the unit. So they're disclosing whether they know if there's lead-based paint hazards or if there's been any lead-based paint work done in the past. They're providing any records. They're providing a pamphlet to the owner. They're providing a disclosure notice. They're also disclosing if they don't know if there was any lead in the unit or not. So disclosure is the first step that we'll be talking about. Then we'll be talking about looking. This is sometimes referred to as evaluation as well. And you're going to start to see two bullets underneath some of these different sections. So in project-based assistance, the requirements differ depending on whether you have up to and including 5,000 per unit per year or more than 5,000 per unit per year. So you need to think about the projects that you're working with and which category are they going to fall into, because depending on which category, the actual requirement differs. So for looking, if it's up to and including 5,000 per unit per year, a visual assessment is what's required. And if it's more than 5,000 per unit per year, a risk assessment is required. So after that looking, if we identify deteriorated paint or if we identified lead-based paint hazards, then we need to do treatment. And the treatment, again, is going to differ depending on which category it falls into. So if it's up to and including 5,000 per unit per year, paint stabilization is going to be the type of treatment that needs to be done. And if it's more than 5,000 per unit per year, then it's interim controls is going to be followed. And like I said, Les is going to go into more detail to explain what is visual assessment, what is risk assessment, what is paint stabilization and interim controls. So after the work has been completed, the unit needs to pass clearance, and this is done by both a visual inspection and dust sampling. And then the owner needs to be told, as well as the residents, they need to be notified in writing where any lead hazards were found, as well as a separate notification of how they were treated and cleared. So that's our tell and our notification area. And then we have maintenance, so maintaining. Again, the requirement for maintaining is going to differ slightly depending on which category you're in. For up to including 5,000 per unit per year, we have ongoing maintenance. And then for over 5,000 per year, we have ongoing maintenance. And in addition to that, we have periodic reevaluation. And we'll go into details about what those are. This is showing you a copy of the summary. So we actually have a handout. Let's see if I can find handout here. Here we go. So this handout was also provided to you. This is a really good what I like to call like a little cheat sheet. I used to keep copies of these next to my office, so if I wasn't quite sure what was that step for Subpart H, I could just pull down the sheet to be able to look at it. So this is available to you as a printout, and this is going over what are the requirements, and again, you need to know which category do you fall into. So are you up to and including 5,000 per unit per year in single-family properties, or are you over 5,000 per year, which is really more common for what we see in project-based assistance. But you'll see we're going to go into more detail about this as we go throughout the module. We have our disclosure, we have our looking, our evaluation, this is our treating, our lead hazard reduction, are we doing paint stabilization, are we doing interim controls, we have our clearance and our telling, we have our ongoing maintenance, and then down here you see EBLL, that stands for Elevated Blood Level Requirements. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's what do we do if we have a child who has an elevated blood level in one of our project-based assistance units. What does the owner need to do? How do we communicate with HUD? That type of thing. So we'll go over all of that later on in our module today. All right, so who is responsible for paying for the costs related to lead safe housing rule for project-based assistance? It is the owner. So the owner is paying for any risk assessments, visual assessment, interim controls, paint stabilization, periodic re-inspections. All right, so now we're going to dive into disclosure. So the disclosure rule applies when selling or leasing a pre-1978 unit. And in this module, we are really focusing on leasing for the webinar. So the property owner is required to disclose knowledge of all known lead-based paint when they are renting these units. And if we were selling, we'd also need to disclose that as well. So we're going to provide you with a really brief overview of the disclosure requirements so that you can comply with the lead safe housing rule. So we do have a handout on the, let me see if I can, there we go. So we have a handout on the disclosure rule. If you're new to working in the housing world or with lead, you're not familiar with this, this is a really good background information, gives you background about where the disclosure rule came from, what's required of that, so you can review that at your leisure. But the lead disclosure rule has been in place since 1996, so it's not new. The purpose was really to provide information about lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards and sharing records and reports. And so these letting people know about this, whether there's any type of history or work that's been done, this is applies to both the unit and any common areas that are servicing that unit. And so common areas, when we refer to that, we're talking about hallways or laundry rooms or garages or exterior surfaces of the building and any play areas. So this applies to almost all pre-1978 for sale and rental units. And the owner is going to be providing the pamphlet, and this is that blue pamphlet you see here, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. This is available on both HUD and EPA's website. It is available in multiple languages. And so they will provide that pamphlet. They're going to provide a copy of the disclosure notice, and they're also going to be identifying in that disclosure where they know any information about the property as it's related to lead. And this has to be, the disclosure notice needs to be completed and signed before any contract is signed. And then if you're renewing a lease and the owner has new information about lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the unit or the common areas, that owner needs to provide a new disclosure notice to the tenant at lease renewal if there is new known information. If nothing has changed, we don't need to provide a second disclosure notice. We're providing that disclosure notice when they first move in. If nothing's changed, we do not need to provide another one at lease renewal. So there may be times when disclosure is exempt. These exemptions are found at 24 CFR 35.82, and this is in Subpart A. But the two most relevant for project-based assistance are the ones that we see in these green circles here. So the first one, and Les mentioned this earlier, lead-based paint free. So if the unit and the areas are found to be lead-based paint free by a certified inspector, then it's exempt from having to do disclosure. So this needs to be certified under a federal certification program or under a federally accredited state or tribal certification program. And then the other one that's more relevant is rentals of existing leasing and target housing where the leaser previously disclosed all information required and no conditions have changed. So we're not really talking about foreclosure because we're not doing sales and we're not dealing with short-term leases where it's saying where no lease renewal can occur, because for project-based assistance, we're always going to be using our units. So again, like I mentioned, these disclosure exemptions really only apply for project-based assistance to these two with the green circles. All right, so we want to make sure that our owners are using the correct form. The form that you see on here, the watch out for lead-based paint poisoning, is not the correct form. HUD often sees different communities and owners using this form. So you don't want to be using this form. The correct form is the disclosure of information on lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards. And this is found on HUD and EPA's website. There's one that's for sale properties. There's also one for rental housing. So you want to make sure that your owners are using the one for rental housing. It is subject to penalties. So a disclosure notice actually has 10 different sections that could be violations per disclosure form, and there's a pretty hefty penalty that's connected to each violation. So it could be almost $19,000 per violation. So if the disclosure notice is not being utilized properly, you could have a $195,000 penalty per lease transaction. So it's really important that the owners you're working with are using the correct disclosure notices, that you show them where to download it or you download it and send it to them. Make sure they're using the correct form. If you are working in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, or the District of Columbia, these states and areas have to use elements of a modified form. So you want to check with your state regulatory authority to make sure you're using the correct disclosure form if you are working in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, or DC. There are sections that are often not completed correctly. HUD often sees issues connected with timing. So they see a lot of disclosure notices that were given after the lease signing. The disclosure notice needs to be provided before or at lease signing, so that timing is really important. HUD has also seen a lot of fraudulent signatures. They've seen where the owner has signed for the tenant. The tenant needs to be able to sign this on their own. And HUD has also seen where reports were not disclosed or shared. So again, make sure you're using the correct disclosure form. Make sure you're avoiding some of these mishaps. So it's important for programs and owners to be aware when there's children under 6 that are residing in the unit. And this information, it's often gathered at the application stage or at lease renewal. And it's really going to help the owner if there's ever a child with an elevated blood level, because then there's a lot of actions that need to take place for other units. So the unit that has an elevated blood level child in it, they'll notify the owner, but then the owner has to take actions on other coverage units. And other coverage units are units in that property that have children under age of 6 residing in those units. So it's important for the owner to have a good handle on that so that they're able to implement the requirements pretty quickly. We do have a resource on our toolkit. We do have, later on in the slides, we have links to get to our toolkit, and you're going to start to see links of different documents that we reference on these slides, and Les and I will say, oh, it's in the toolkit. So we did unveil a toolkit on Lead Safe Housing Rule a number of months ago now, and we have one for Subpart H, we have one for elevated blood level children. So if you need sample forms, you can go to that toolkit on the HUD Exchange and download the sample form. You can customize that form to make it work for your program, but there are sample forms available to you, and one of these is trying to keep track of the children under 6 residing in your project-based assistant units. And so here's one resource that we have available to you. It's also important for ongoing maintenance to help educate our tenants about how to live safely in a pre-1978 unit. So we want our tenants to be on the lookout for any deteriorated paint. So the owner is required to instruct the tenants to inform them of any deteriorated paint in the unit or the common areas. And deteriorated paint, we're talking about peeling, chipping paint, cracked paint, paint that's being rubbed off by friction or impact surfaces such as maybe a door jamb or a stair or a window. It also includes painted surfaces that are damaged by water or even just paint that's damp, even if that paint is intact. So that's what we mean by deteriorated paint. It's really important for our tenants to notify the owner as soon as they see any deteriorated paint in their units or the common areas. Remember those common areas? Those are our hallways, our laundry rooms, our garages, exterior, and our play areas. So the owner is going to instruct our tenants to let them know if they see deteriorated paint. They're also going to inform the landlord about the number of children under the age of 6 that are residing in that unit. And we're also going to encourage the tenants to keep that Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home pamphlet. That's that blue pamphlet. Let's see here, this pamphlet here, because in the pamphlet it actually provides some good tips on how do you maintain a home that's pre-78. It talks about different cleaning, how to be able to keep dust under control, how to keep it safe for your family. And again, we list the resource here on tracking occupants and expected occupants. All right, so here's the documentation required for that disclosure step. We would have a copy of the disclosure form, making sure that it has proper signatures, that it's been dated properly, and then that there's tenant instructions about how they should be reporting deteriorated paint. All right, we have a knowledge check that we're going to set up as a poll, I believe. Yep, there we go. Thanks, Sharita. So it should show up as a poll for you, and then you can choose what you think is the correct answer. So the question is true or false? So at lease renewal, the owner needs to provide the disclosure notice again to the tenant. There has not been any changes to the household or the unit. So what do you think? Is this true or false? All right, looks like the poll has ended. Let's see what people chose. All right, well, the majority of you got this correct. The correct answer is false. So if nothing has changed to the unit or the common areas, then you do not need a new disclosure notice. So this, again, is at lease renewal. When somebody first moves in and they originally signed their lease, they are going to get the disclosure notice either before they sign the lease or when they're signing the lease. But at renewal, if nothing has changed, they do not need another disclosure notice. So Les, is there any questions that have come up that we should cover, or anything we need to expand on before you dive into evaluation?
No, actually, we don't have any questions.
Okay. All right. Well, I will, let's see if I can hand this ball over to you.
Yep, that worked. Great. All right. So we're going to continue kind of walking through the key steps that Chris introduced a little bit ago, and I'll just take you back to our summary chart that we were sort of looking at. So Chris has been talking about the disclosure as part of this, and we know about some of the exemptions as part of that. But we're now going to move into talking about how we're going to make the evaluation for this property, and that's going to be the section we're now going to be going into. All right. So I'm going to cover a little bit about what the different levels of evaluation are, and as you'll see as we dive into this specific subpart, depending on the level of assistance that's being provided to this property, we can have different, we may have different levels that are going to be required. And so the subpart that you were following is going to set what that level of evaluation is, and that's also going to then impact what the level of training, certification, who can actually do that work. So for our properties where we have less, we have up to $5,000 per unit per year, we're going to be following a visual assessment. And we'll talk more through the details of this, but essentially this is a visual inspection going room by room, looking for evidence of what we've been talking about as unstable paint surfaces. So, you know, chipping, peeling paint, evidence of dust or other debris that might be building up on the floor, maybe in, you know, on windowsills, other places like that. And then based on that visual assessment, we'll be determining whether there are lead hazards potentially that would need to be addressed as part of that. For our properties where we have more than $5,000 per unit per year, then we're going to have a higher level of requirement on this. So we're going to be doing a lead-based paint inspection. So we're actually going to determine, is the paint that we're looking at, does it actually include lead or not? So we're going to be doing either using an XRF analyzer, and we'll show you a little bit more on that a little later, but essentially it's sort of X-raying the substrate and determining are any of those layers lead. Or in the absence of being able to use that piece of equipment, we could be cutting little samples out and sending them off to a lab to be able to analyze on this. So when we talk about our visual assessment, we're not doing that paint inspection and testing to actually determine is this, does this contain lead or not. So when we have this higher level, 5,000, more than 5,000 per unit per year, we're actually doing a paint inspection to determine if we have lead-based paint. And we're also going to be doing a risk assessment. So that risk assessment is going to go through surface by surface, and it's going to determine where we have actual lead-based paint hazards. So not only do we have lead that's contained, but it is creating a hazard. So looking at deteriorated paint, again, evidence of things like dust, where we have bare soil, where a child might come into contact with that soil, that contamination. Water is not included in this. It would be something that could be optionally included in your program, but it is not required by the lead-safe housing rule. So specifically for Subpart H, as we mentioned and we saw on the chart, we sort of have two-tiered approach here based on our level of financial involvement in that property. So we're going to be looking at an average per unit per year level of assistance. If it's up to and including $5,000, then we're going to be completing a visual assessment, and that's going to be happening on an annual basis, but it also would be happening anytime we have turnover in that unit. And so the question of who can do that, This could be done by staff or contractor. They do need to have training, but that training and certification are available online. So this would easily be, in completing a visual assessment, something that staff, property manager, staff maintenance, could go online and be able to take that training and have that certification. That would be something you would have in file to be able to show that, yes, we're following the requirements of Subpart H, we're conducting a visual assessment, and we have certification in our file to show that the person that completed that had the appropriate training. You'll notice at the bottom of this slide, we have a link for the visual assessment. The last bullet here is for that online visual assessment training and certification that you could utilize to have staff be certified with that. And then that next to the last bullet is a log form that could be used. So as that person is going through room by room, they would be able to use this sample document to record the details of their inspection, what they found, what they did not find, dated, signed, and that would also give you that paper trail that you need to be able to document that that was completed. So that's our sort of lower tier requirement, units up to and including $5,000 per unit per year. On properties where our subsidy levels are higher, so we're over that $5,000 per unit per year calculation, then we have a higher level of evaluation, and so that's where we're going to do our lead-based paint inspection. So we're going to determine, does that paint actually include lead, and then also our risk assessment. So that also must be completed by certified personnel, and we're going to talk in another, I think, slide about access on training or identifying those qualified folks. So this also is going to require, we'll go through this in a little more detail, it's going to require a periodic reevaluation. So that risk assessment would have to be repeated after 2 years had gone by. For the rest of the time, we'll be following this visual assessment requirement on an annual basis and at unit turnover, but we do have this reoccurrence of being required to do a risk assessment again every 2 years. And we'll go into further detail on that. So let's talk about, so I need to get that lead inspection and risk assessment done. How am I going to do that? Well, a lot of you may be needing to procure that individual. So depending on whether you are triggering public procurement, you may need to be issuing a request for proposal or request for qualifications. So if you are seeking bidders who are going to perform these duties for you, you would need, as part of that RFP, RFQ that you issue, to ensure that you call out the licensing and certification requirements as part of that. Be specific about the level of what you're seeking, whether it's a risk assessment, the paint inspection. You might be doing procurement to have the clearance done, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. Might be that you're looking for all of the above, and so you would be very clear in that RFP or RFQ about what you were seeking, the documentation that you would expect to have included in that. And there is a link for some HUD guidelines that provide some more information on that. So when you're seeking certified renovation firms or licensed inspectors, risk folks to do a risk assessment for you, you've got some resources. So since the EPA is leading the training and certification process, you can use the EPA's homepage for lead and be able to look up certified renovation firms, also training programs. So if you decided, this makes sense for our own staff, maybe for our maintenance staff, to get this training, this would also allow you to pull up to see where you had approved RRP training providers in your area. Now, as Chris mentioned, we do have some states that have their own RRP program, and so you would need to follow that, go to the state agency for that information. And we will have a reference for that, I think, just a little bit later here. A couple of other sources in trying to determine, do we have qualified folks in this area? If you are in an area where you have a local entitlement community or participating jurisdiction who is operating a CDBG or home-funded program, they may well, particularly if they are running things like a homeowner rehabilitation program, which is pretty common, they may already have a list of certified firms in your area and may be able to provide some referrals on those. Also, if in the area you have a recipient of the lead-based paint hazard control funding, they also would be actively working in this area and would probably have referrals for you. So we've provided these links to be able to identify where you have CDBG or home grantees in your area, and then also you can look at this bottom link at where the latest communities are that have received the lead hazard control funding. And those would be good references for you also. So the online resource that we mentioned with the EPA allows you to go in and plug in what it is you're looking for. And so this would allow you to then set your location, set a distance on that, and you would be able to then identify where there were folks in your area. You could also, with this, be able to verify that the EPA is listing them as being a currently certified firm as part of that. And so we've provided a link, and that should be useful for you. For the visual assessment, as we mentioned, this is when a visual room-by-room inspection is being done where we're looking for signs of deteriorated paint, but also for dust, debris, paint chips, those sorts of things. And we mentioned about that there's a log to be able to use as part of that. So this, again, is our linkage for that online training. It's free. It can be done easily online, and then have a certification for that. And so you might be saying, in preparation for compliance with this, I need to get one of my own staff to take this, complete it, and then have that in your files to be able to show that, yes, I am completing these annual and a turnover visual assessments. Here's who's doing it, and here's the evidence that they have the appropriate training and certification on that. That's something that does not expire. You might choose to have folks go back and take that training again from time to time just as a refresher, but it does not have an expiration date on that. And then we mentioned about the visual assessment finding and resolution report. So this is really a form to be able to track what you found, taking pictures to be able to include that information will be important. And this will be the basis of when we talk next about treating. It's what you found in that visual assessment is going to be the basis for when you hire an RRP certified contractor to then come in and make those take those corrective actions for you. It's going to be based on what you found as part of your visual assessment. So having a good log of that would be really important. And so we talked about visual assessment is required when we are up to and including $5,000 per unit per year in assistance that's occurring. But we mentioned that when we go above $5,000, then we have a higher standard. And so in those cases, we're going to be conducting the lead-based paint inspection, which we talked about, using a certified lead inspector or risk assessor. So this is a surface-by-surface testing, determining where we have lead-based paint in that unit, but also then determining as part of that risk assessment if it is a hazard. And so we talked about that includes things like dust, soil contamination, unstable painted surfaces as part of that. So not only does it determine where we have visual evidence, but it's going to have to then determine, is this actually lead-based paint? And so I mentioned earlier that either we're going to be testing with our XRF machine, and so we would have a printout that would be showing us where lead was found in that unit, or we might have lab results of samples that were removed to be able to identify that. You're going to see as we go through this, and this is something that's relatively new, is that we now have a series of videos that allow you to kind of participate in some of these key steps. So there is a video now of going through that lead-based paint inspection process, and I think that would be really helpful just to kind of have a visual understanding of what's involved. This is the link for that at the bottom of the slide, and we'll also be mentioning that again when we get to the end and kind of go through where all these resources and sample tools can be located. So the EPA regulations for lead-based paint inspection lay out the specific requirements, the methods and standards that are going to be used, and it's essentially determining, do we have lead-based paint or not, and that's going to be not only on existing deterioration, but would also incorporate in the case where we are doing maintenance or rehabilitation. If we were doing a rehabilitation project that fell under Subpart J, we would also be looking at that scope of work that was being proposed to determine, is the work that we're doing going to disturb any painted surfaces that include lead paint. So wanted to point out the current standards, the EPA dust hazard standards. These were updated in 2020. The EPA authorized states had a little bit of a delay on implementing them, but I want to make sure that our folks are paying attention to the current on this. So we have standards specifically for dust sampling, and it's based on where we are sampling. So for carpeted floors and hard floors, we have a 10 micrograms per square foot is our requirement. For interior window sills, we have a higher level of 100 micrograms per square foot. And you'll see that these are now more stringent requirements than under the prior, before 2020 regulations. Also, we have separate standards for bare soil, and it depends on whether this is a play area versus a non-play area. Those would need to be followed. And then if we were going to be testing water as part of our program, again, not something that's required, but we, we also then have standards in place as far as that. So we mentioned earlier, and I think Chris mentioned this also, that if you were in a state that had an EPA authorized program, that you might have more stringent requirements. And so we provided a link here to be able to look and see if you are in a state that has an EPA authorized state program. And I would encourage folks to check that to make sure whether they need to pay attention to the state-specific regulations versus deferring to the EPA standards. Let's talk a little bit about that risk assessment. So we talked about paint testing and a risk assessment being required for units that are above $5,000 per unit per property, and so per year. And so in this case, not only are we going to test the paint to determine if it has lead in it, but also we're going to be doing our risk assessment. So the risk assessment is really looking to see where do we have lead-based paint hazards. And then collecting some information on what's the, how severe is this, because as part of this, not only is that risk assessment in partnership with the visual assessment going to be identifying where we have deteriorated paint, it's going to determine with the paint testing whether it actually contains lead-based paint as part of that. And we'll be talking about the risk assessment is also going to then be laying out what needs to be done on this? What are the next steps, the corrective actions that need to be done? So looking for evidence of deteriorated paint, dust, other debris, but also looking and testing friction surfaces, impact surfaces, testing dust, and also the soil as part of that. And again, we've got a newly created video that allows you to kind of look over the shoulder of the folks completing one of these and to see how that process actually works. I would encourage you. I think they're great to be able to sort of see that visual on this. So this is a visual for the XRF machine. So essentially, we're X-raying using the machine to be able to X-ray each of the surfaces that we are testing, and it's going to be able to then print out and identify where we have lead or where we don't have lead. And again, we've got a video that allows you to see that actually being completed. So at the completion of doing our XRF testing, we have a printout, a report on our surface-by-surface sampling, and then what the results were of what was included. So we're determining where we have lead paint, and then we are going to, with our risk assessment, determine where that lead paint is creating a hazard. So that risk assessment report is always going to be completed by a certified risk assessor, and they are going to be collecting information about the property. They're going to be laying out what was our inspection process, where did we test, collecting all that information along with that testing surface by surface results. And from that, then that report will also include a lead hazard control plan. So you as the property owner, when you're being told that, based on this, we need to bring in a certified crew to be able to treat those surfaces, that risk assessment report, when this has been triggered for those over 5,000 per unit per year, will lay out a lead hazard control plan, which would be part of those specifications you would then use with a certified contractor to come in and do that work. Part of that plan includes all that data that's been collected as part of your XRS process on that. So there is a risk assessment report checklist, so you could use that to review that report and determine that all of the required information. So things like, the date of when the assessment was done, identifying the building, date of construction, all sort of the contact information, but then going through the report would go through the results of not only the visual inspection, but also the location of where the testing was done and the results for that, along with that lead hazard control plan as part of that. So a lot of information contained in that that then becomes the basis for when we talk about treatment as part of that. So kind of in line with what we've been talking about, this making sure that we are doing disclosure and notification along the way, there is a requirement that after that lead hazard evaluation has been completed, and this is really triggered at the point we've received that report back, then within 15 days after we get the results from our evaluation, you're required to issue a lead hazard evaluation notice that would go to the owner and it would go to the occupants of that structure. So what that notification is going to include is providing information about the presence and location of lead-based paint, what was found as part of that evaluation process. It would also include information about if I, as an owner or tenant, want to get more information. So as I as a tenant, want to know where were all of the places. I would like to see the report, see the testing levels that were found in each of these surfaces. It would include information on how to be able to do that. And so that property owner is required to then provide a copy of the testing reports, the risk assessment, inspections as part of this disclosure rule process. So key thing here is that 15 days starts at the point that the results have been received back. So needing a plan of action on who's going to be responsible for doing that and making sure that that gets done within that timeline. So documentation in this step, as we've been mentioning, depending on the level of evaluation that's required, we're always going to have a personnel that is certified for that. It might be a visual assessment where we have documentation to show that this person took the online training and has certification. In the case where we are having paint testing and a risk assessment done, we would need that information in the file to be able to document that was completed by someone with appropriate evaluation. With that, we would then also expect to see that the findings for either the visual assessment, the findings in that log that we mentioned, or in the case where we're doing lead-based paint inspection and risk assessment, we would have that information, that report in place, and then of course we mentioned that there's a requirement that that disclosure notice go out within 15 days. So we would need evidence of that within the file. All right, so I think before we go into the next section, I would guess the folks are probably ready for a little bit of a break. I have that it is 21 minutes after the hour. I think if we could come back at 2:30, that will give folks a chance for a little break before we go into the rest of the information here. All right, welcome back. So we're going to move ahead into the next section, but I noticed there were a number of questions that had come through. It's important to understand that specifically today in this presentation, we're talking about Subpart H, which is specific for project-based assistance. So, if you were, running a program that perhaps you were doing renovation, that would be on Subpart J. So kind of the first, you think back to, Chris showed the chart with all the different subparts. The key thing here is to make sure that depending on the activity that you are undertaking, that you're going to follow the right subpart on that. And there are trainings that are posted for those other areas, because I'm going to guess that some of you are doing multiple types of activities. Specifically today, we're just talking about where we have project-based assistance. Chris, anything else you want to call out before we move on?
If I can find my mute button. I've been putting in the chat the link to get to the trainings. I know we have them later on as well, but I put a couple in the chat links to get to the trainings, and I will find the toolkit one and put that in there too.
All right, so let's go ahead and keep moving. Hopefully you are a little reinvigorated from the short break that you had. So I'm just going to go back to this handout that we were, not that one, that we were looking at earlier. And so we've been talking about the visual assessment and versus a risk assessment depending on that level of assistance. So again, it's based on looking at the total subsidy that's being provided and looking at that on an average per unit per year to determine what the level of requirement is going to be. So we've talked about completing that visual assessment, providing our notification on that, and then based on what we have discovered with our required level of evaluation, now we're going to need to talk about treatment on that. And so you'll see from our chart, again, we have a difference following this if we are falling under our 5,000 up to 5,000 per unit per year category, or some projects will then be in our column where we then have a higher level of requirement because of that dollar per unit per year. All right. So So levels overall for treatment, before we get into what we specifically are doing for Subpart H, our paint stabilization, which is sort of our most minimal. So based on our visual assessment, we would be addressing those surfaces that have been identified as being unstable or where we had evidence of dust and other debris. So we would be dealing with those surfaces, removing, repairing any of that loose paint and damaged area, and then we're going to be talking about doing a clearance testing at the completion of that work. So we'd probably be removing that and then repainting that so that we have all stable surfaces. If we're sort of the next level up is going to be interim controls, and we are going through a set of measures that are going to temporarily reduce the potential harm from these hazards. So we might be doing some kind of treatment that would include things like repair painting, maybe temporary containment of some kind, and then of course doing our cleaning, our clearance testing as part of that. We're not being required to do under this subpart to do abatement, but if your program is doing abatement, that's a higher level where we are then either permanently removing the lead-based paint and they're creating the hazards, or we could be doing a containment that has at least a 20-year life expectancy on that. So we might be, covering that with something mechanically attached to contain that potential. So sometimes you'll hear folks talk about it's been tested and found to be lead safe, and other times they would say lead free. So we said, you would be exempted from disclosure if you had a property that had been inspected and found to be lead free, and that might be either it never had lead, or maybe they've done abatement and completely removed all of the lead in that property and it's now been determined to be lead free. If you have that documentation in place, that would exempt you then from any further requirement on disclosure after that had been completed. So for project-based assistance, we have two levels as we were showing on the chart. So if we're up to and including $5,000 per unit per year, then we're simply going to be doing paint stabilization. So we're removing, treating those painted surfaces, repairing them, putting on a new protective coat of paint on that. And of course, we'll be talking about doing clearance testing before we consider that project to be complete. If we have more than $5,000 per unit, then we're a little bit of a higher step on this, where we're going to do our interim controls, and that is going to be laid out by our risk assessment report, which will have a hazard control plan as part of that report, and we'll really follow what our risk assessment report has provided as the appropriate interim controls to be completed as part of that. And that would be the basis for then when we are procuring or contracting with a certified RRP contractor to be able to do that work. That hazard control plan will be the basis for the work that's going to be completed on that. And keep in mind, the work that is being done, whether it's paint stabilization or interim controls, it must be completed by a certified contractor or renovator. If we were doing abatement, we would be making sure that we had certified abatement workers and contractors and supervisors as part of that. So we're always going to need to make sure that our files contain that information, that any procurement or choice of who's going to do that work, that we're following that level of requirement to make sure that we have the appropriate personnel as part of that. So as part of this process, if we are going through a bidding process, a procurement process, we're going to need to make sure that as part of their bid on this, that they would also include, respond to your scope of work, which would call out the level of training and certification that was required. That would be included in their bid response on that. And you would need to be able to review that and determine that, yes, you had a qualified bidder based on having appropriate training and certification. Programs that are regularly doing this sort of thing oftentimes will have a pre-qualified list of contractors, and that might be something that if you were doing a lot of, let's say, project-based assistance, you had enough units that it made sense to, in advance, have a contractor that you'd already gone through procurement. You could certainly do that and have a pre-qualified list that bid packets only went out to this prescribed group. In the case where the owner of the property, who is responsible for this, is not triggering federal procurement, keep in mind that they won't have to go through, unless you've added that requirement, they won't have to go through a procurement process. We still need to make sure that they are following this to make sure that they have qualified personnel. And so you may need to be making sure that they understand what the requirements are that apply, what that documentation would need to be to determine that they've got an appropriately qualified contractor, and maybe working with them on ensuring that that's in case. So the contractors have to be trained under the EPA RRP training program, and that's for any pre-1978 housing, which is what we're working with, but keep in mind that also covers child-occupied facilities. And that applies whether they have federal funding in place or not. So let's talk just a little bit about the EPA Renovation, Repair, and Painting Rule. There is a handout that I think Chris mentioned earlier on this. And so the EPA rule is put in place to try to make sure that as contractors are doing work that could disturb surfaces that include lead, that they're not essentially creating hazards based on the way that they're completing that work. And so, as we just mentioned, it applies whether we have federal funding in place or not, and it's for any residential child care facilities or preschools that were built prior to 1978. So in those cases where we have a contractor working in one of these scenarios, they have to have their firm certified by the EPA, or in some cases, we mentioned we have a state EPA authorized program. So we need to make sure that those renovators have received training through one of the EPA approved training providers, that they are following lead-safe work practices, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, I believe. They are required, and this is separate from the disclosure protecting your family pamphlet that was talked about. Under the EPA rule, the contractor is required to provide the Renovate Right pamphlet for any of those properties that we're working, and there is a civil penalty, rather significant, for that. So we need to make sure that that has been done. So how do we identify when we need an RRP certified contractor? How are we going to find them? So again, our EPA website will allow us to do a search on that, also to be able to identify where those training programs are. So for instance, if you are providing project-based assistance to a property owner, and we now have a property that has to have treatment completed, we know that it has to be completed by an RRP certified renovator. We could be guiding them to use this linkage to identify those firms that would be qualified that are within your area to be able to find a contractor to complete that work. And in the case of if you wanted to have an existing contractor get the needed training to be able to be certified, you could route them to this source also. So I want to kind of quickly walk through some of the key differences between the lead-safe housing rule and the Renovate, Repair, and Paint rule of the EPA. So first off, the level of testing that's going to be required. If you're required to determine whether there's lead-based paint present or not, which we have when we have units where we have $5,000 per unit per year, more than $5,000 per unit per year, then we need to be using a lead-based paint inspector or a risk assessor to be able to complete that. The EPA rule would allow that renovator to simply use a test kit. So they're kind of scoring the paint and using this dauber kit on there, which will turn a color to indicate whether there is lead present. That's allowable under EPA. That is not allowable under Lead Safe Housing Rule. So when we are triggering that we have to do paint testing, that will need to follow the Lead Safe Housing Rule, which is a higher standard. Also, there are differences in the level of training. And so we need to have workers and supervisors that have completed the Lead Safe work practices training. There is an exception when we can have non-certified workers that are receiving on-the-job training, and that's only if they're supervised by a certified lead-based paint abatement supervisor and they are on site with them. So a little higher standard about the training on this. We mentioned this bottom bullet here about, let me click here, about there's a pamphlet specifically for Renovate and Write that needs to be provided by that contractor, and that's part of the EPA requirements. Also, keep in mind our target for under the HUD, Lead Safe Housing Rule, is based on housing units and prevention. And then depending on the subpart that you're following, that treatment of hazards is going to be for this subpart is going to be based on either paint stabilization or interim controls. And so we really look to the subpart on this to make that determination. Wanted to talk just a little bit about safe work practices, and we have some things that are prohibited. So EPA calls out and says you can't use an open flame or torch or heat gun above 1100 degrees or some kind of mechanical, like a belt sander without a HEPA vac attachment on that. So those sort of work practices are prohibited. And your contractors that are certified under the EPA regulation would be familiar with that. What they might be missing is the fact that your funding is triggering the Lead Safe Housing Rule, and HUD has an additional 6 work practices that are prohibited. So making sure as part of your contract specifications that it's called out that they're following the HUD regulations, and so we have more prohibited work practices on this. We also mentioned earlier about these de minimis standards, and so we do have more stringent de minimis standards under the HUD rule rather than the EPA. We want to make sure that we're following HUD's de minimis standards on that. Another really key thing, and we're going to be in the next section talking about the clearance process. When we're working under the Lead Safe Housing Rule, we have to go through a clearance process. So once that treatment has been completed, we're going to be using a certified third party that's going to come in and collect samples, dust samples. There's going to be a visual inspection as part of that, but those samples will be collected by a third party. They'll be sent off to a lab to then determine whether we have brought down the level of particulate of lead that still remains in place to determine, yes, this has now met our thresholds and it's now safe for that unit to be reoccupied or that space to be reused. Under EPA, it's less stringent. They can simply do a cleaning on that, and they simply need to be able to verify that the cleaning has been done, but they're not doing this third-party sampling and sending out for a lab. So it's important that our contractors understand this particular project that you're working on is triggering the lead-safe housing rule, and so there's a different standard in place. And I will point out here, it is specifically called out that it is a third party that is going to be doing this certification. So we would not allow the contractor who completed the work to be able to collect those samples, maybe kind of strategically avoiding some areas that they're not as confident about on that. So it's going to be a third party completing that work and then sending the samples and then sending it off to a lab. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section. We'll also be talking about the fact that, again, we're going to keep the occupants informed on this. EPA doesn't have any requirements on this, but HUD is going to require that we are going to notify the owner and the occupants within 15 days, again, of that lead hazard evaluation work and the clearance that has been completed. So we keep them, at the beginning we're disclosing anything we know, and as we are doing evaluation and then treatment, we're going to keep those occupants and owner informed of that. So if we were doing abatement, we would need to have an abatement contractor, and that would, when we talk about abatement, as we mentioned before, these are treatments that have a 20-year, at a minimum, a 20-year life expectancy, making sure that we've removed the lead paint and dust or enclosed it in some way. Sometimes we're simply going to remove components and replace them. And that would include if we have contaminated soil. We might be removing that soil. In a lot of cases, we're going to be covering. So we might, be planting grass or shrubs or something in that place. So we're going to protect the exposure of anyone to that bare soil. Always we're going to be making sure, and that would be part of our oversight responsibility, we're making sure that when work is being done, that we have certified contractors who are following those safe lead work practices. So things like making sure all the dust and debris is being controlled. We mentioned about not being able to, use, some kind of mechanical removal without a HEPA vac attachment. So, controlling that dust and debris. We want to make sure that workers are protected, that they're using appropriate methodologies on this, but we're also going to be talking a little bit here about the occupants themselves of that unit and their possessions, making sure that they are going to be protected as part of that. So we might be segregating that work area. I mentioned at the beginning that we're concerned about workers who have much higher levels of exposure to lead because of the work that we're doing. So we're making sure that they're protected, but we're also protecting that work area so that we're not causing cross-contamination as workers come and go from those work areas. And that includes things like your HVAC system, your heating, cooling system would be sealed off while that work was being done so that it was not, the return system isn't essentially pulling in the dust and debris from your work area and then distributing it throughout that unit. So that's all part of our safe work practices. We'll be talking about the fact that we may need at times to relocate the occupants of that unit while the work is being completed. And then at the completion of our treatment, we always will be doing a cleaning and making sure that we've collected all that dust and debris that might have been created. So that's usually going to be done working wet and cleaning wet. Also the use of a HEPA vac, which is a vacuum that has a filtration system that's be able to collect more of that minute particulate as part of that. And then we mentioned we're going to be doing a third-party clearance and then providing a notice. Again, here's a link for RRP training providers that we mentioned about as part of the EPA site on that. All right, so some key sources on this. We've mentioned about safe work practices. The Renovate Right brochure, which is required to be provided to the owner occupants by the RRP certified contractor, has a lot of really good information in it. I actually found it a very interesting read as part of that. We've talked about controlling dust, trying to segregate work areas, dealing with the HVAC system, how we're going to work and clean. We'll mention this again later, but one of our really helpful resources is there is a whole set of interpretive guidance on a topic-by-topic basis. So we provided the link here, but specifically within that guidance, there is S4 and R13, which are going into more detail, some guidance about lead-safe units and also on interim clearance that might be appropriate based on this specific topic on that. And then there is, we'll be mentioning, there is a post-work checklist for lead hazard reduction to be able to document and confirm that the required safe work practices, protections for occupants, those sorts of things have been implemented for the project. And then we'll mention, and we'll be looking at this in the resource list, in the HUD guidelines, chapter by chapter, cover topics. So chapter 8 is where resident protection and worksite preparation is covered in great detail. And this is really sort of the go-to resource on this. If you're not familiar with that, I think that would be something to spend some time on getting familiar. So let's talk a little bit about occupant protections. So we need to make sure while work is being done that we're protecting those occupants from exposure to any lead hazards that we're creating while we're working. And that also includes their belongings. So, if we are going to be working we might say, well, the occupants can't be here, but if we leave their belongings in that room, they then may be covered or contaminated. And, depending on what it is, it may not be something that we can actually effectively clean. And so a planning process in this is making sure that we determine whether the occupants can remain in that unit, where's our work going to occur, what belongings are in that area, and have a plan to make sure that we're going to be covered on that. So we need to make sure that those are protected. That might be included in the statement of work with that contractor, and that might include temporarily moving that household somewhere else. So it might be simply overnight or a couple of nights we need to have them stay maybe in a local hotel or motel, and we're going to provide some vouchers to cover their meal preparation. If we had a unit that was more involved and they were going to need to be out of that longer, then it may be that we would need to move them to a unit that was going to be more functionally equivalent. So, if they're going to be out for a couple weeks, a month, then they probably need to be somewhere where they have cooking facilities. So maybe that's a short-term rental. Maybe we're able to shift them to another unit on that same property that we've already determined is safe for them, and then move them back once that work has been completed. So we need to make sure that that temporary unit where we place them is considered to be lead safe. So that either would need to be a post-1978 unit, or we would need to have performed a clearance examination on that to make sure that it's free of hazards. So, if we had a property that had multiple units, we might be able to identify a vacant unit, do the clearance on that, and be able to shift households into that unit while the work was being done on their unit. Other cases, we're going to find a post-1978 hotel or motel in the area and shift the tenant there. All of that needs to be planned for and thought of on the front end on this. So let's talk about when we need to relocate folks. So if we need that tenant to be out of that unit to be able to have the work done, so we don't have the ability to, cordon off that particular work area and still have that unit be functional for them. So if we are cordoning off, kitchen, bathroom, sleeping areas that they are going to need, and we can't get them back within an 8-hour workday. So completing the work and getting the clearance tests done and getting the results, we can't return folks until we've determined that we've met clearance. And so if we can't, maybe we have a spare bedroom and that's where this work is being done, we can move their possessions out of that room and they still can occupy the unit by us containing that particular room. Then we might be able to avoid relocation. Otherwise, we're going to have to temporarily relocate them. Now, times that we don't have to relocate, we might be doing work that's not going to disturb paint. We mentioned before if we were switching out a water heater, we're not causing displacement to be occurred. In some cases, it's something that we can get in very quickly. Maybe we have just a couple of spots where we have some unstable paint surfaces. We would be able to contain the area, be able to do that work, repaint, do our clearance testing, and then allow that tenant to be able to reoccupy and do that within an 8-hour workday. That's perfectly fine. We also might be only dealing with the exterior, and then we could seal around windows, make sure that we're not going to have occupants needing to pass through where there may be some contamination. That would also be acceptable. We've mentioned in cases where we could allow the unit to be occupied because we can cordon off space. If we can complete that treatment within a 5-calendar day, that would also be allowable. Now, I'll mention that we have the ability for an elderly occupant, after being informed and signing for consent, that they could say, I am going to waive being temporarily relocated while this work is being done. There is specifically interpretive guidance on that. We've provided you the link on that, and then also some additional linkage about if you were needing to do relocation, some further detail about that. So these are sort of go-to resources if you have a project that is going to include needing to be able to do that. So as part of our documentation on this, we have a form to be able to document what needed to be done. Was the occupant able to continue to occupy that unit and we're containing that work area? Were we relocating folks? And so there is a form to be able to document that, and we've provided a linkage on that. So in the file, as far as our documentation on our treatment, so key thing here is we need to, based on the level of treatment that's being done, whether it's paint stabilization or whether it's interim controls, we need to make sure that we're able to document that we had an RRP certified contractor, that certification is in place in that file. We also need to be able to document that in that undertaking that they followed our lead hazard reduction, safe work practices, and so we have a checklist as part of that. We mentioned about occupant protections, and there is a form to be able to use on that. And then also think about how you're going to provide monitoring on this to ensure that this is being done following this methodology, how you would capture any sort of inspection notices as part of this. And then I think one of the critical things here is that statement of work. So based on either our visual assessment or that risk assessment, laying out what is the treatment that needs to be completed, and that would be part of not only your file, but when we talk about a scope of work in a contract for the certified personnel that are completing that unit, that work, that would of course be critical as part of that. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris. Hopefully you can find your unmute button.
Trying to get there. You usually do clearance, Les. I usually pick up at the
right.
tell. But
well, no wonder. So let's, and I, for some reason, got a different notation here. All right. So let's talk about clearance, and this is really our last step. So as we've been mentioning, once that hazard reduction work has been completed, whether it is paint stabilization or our interim controls, before we consider that project to be complete, we need to have our clearance done. It needs to be done by a certified personnel. We mentioned it needs to be a third party. And we're going to be doing sampling, sending those samples off to a lab, and determining whether we now are within the requirements for dust on this. So depending on the level of work that we're doing, it's really essentially the same here, that clearance needs to be performed by a certified risk assessor or lead-based paint inspector. The difference is on the non-abatement work that we also have the ability, if you have sampling technician in your area, that they could be utilized. You'll notice, again, we're talking about no conflict of interest. That's why we need to make sure that it's a third party. So they're not somehow connected to the contractor. So they are making their own decisions about where they're going to sample and test, and then they're going to be sending those results or those samples off to a lab to have that be completed. I'll just mention this last bullet point. In some cases, and I don't know that we'll would be doing this with project-based assistance, but in some cases we might also be doing some non-lead work as part of this while we're dealing with this. So we might have our lead certified contractor complete their portion of the work, do an interim clearance, and then allow another contractor to enter that workspace, do the non-lead work on that. If that was the scenario, once all work had been completed, we would need to do a final clearance to make sure that they, as part of their non-lead work, hadn't disturbed and created any other hazards as part of that. All right, so when we're doing a clearance, I've been mentioning that we're going to collect samples. So first, we're going to do that same visual assessment. So we're looking, doing a visual to see, are there still signs of deteriorated paint or dust, debris that haven't been addressed with this? And we will be looking at our scope of work, looking at all those areas where work has been done. We talked about the fact that the contractor would be doing a wet cleaning, so they should have resolved all of the visual evidence that we would be seeing. But beyond that, just visual assessment, we are going to be then doing dust sampling. So we're going to be using our dust wipes, labeling those, sealing them in containers. You'll see a little visual here on this. And those are then sent off to a lab who is going to test each of those samples and make a determination what the level of dust containment that was still in that. So we're either going to get a report back that says, yes, each of these samples has passed and is at an acceptable level now, or they may be failing some or all of those. And in that case, what's going to need to happen is that contractor will return to the site. They'll re-clean all of that area, and then we'll do another clearance test. Hopefully, we will not continue to need to do that, but we're not going to be finished until we have our tests all come back passing those requirements. And so we're not going to pay the contractor. We're not going to consider the project to be completed until that clearance testing has passed. There again, we've got a video here that you could watch, which kind of takes you through that process and allows you to kind of follow along as that's being done. So when we are doing our dust wipe samples, are going to be collected by that third party, sent off to the lab, and then based on our dust clearance levels that we referenced earlier, on each one of those samples, and of course we're identifying where the sample came from, what type of surface, so that they know what the standard is going to be, that they're going to then provide the results back and say, yeah, sample 7 passed. It was from a hard wood surface, and here are the results. It's within our acceptable range. And so you would have a detailed report as part of that. So the documentation that you would expect to see within that file, again, we always need to make sure that the personnel who are completing that work, and in this case is going to be a certified risk assessor, that certification is going to be in the file to document who completed it, and then that clearance report, which will detail, where samples were completed, the lab results. We may have notations of, we had some failed testing, recleaning was done, here is our next, and we would keep doing that until we had an acceptable clearance report for each of our test areas. All right. With that, Chris, do we have questions that relate to this that we should handle, or do you want to move forward?
Let me look. We have a lot of people asking about Subpart J, which we're not talking about today, so we have put the link in there. People were asking about, how does that 5,000 work out, because they're providing more than 5,000 in one unit but not the other units, and HUD had said the requirements apply to the property receiving more than 5,000 per unit, so they would need to follow that higher threshold. Yeah. Let's see. And then just reinforcing what you had just gone through for project-based assistance. Greater than 5,000 are risk assessments required, interim controls, and then you would need to use a certified renovator to, in RRP to be able to conduct the interim controls on the paint, any dust and soil hazards as well.
I think following the chart as a good reference to kind of help remind folks of what's required here. It will be key.
Yep, and here's the chart that we have here.
All right, I will turn to.
Okay, I get back to the slides here. All right, so thanks, Les. Les went through a lot of different areas. Now we're going to talk about the telling stage, or notification, as you'll see it referred to in the regulations. So notification is required after any paint stabilization or interim controls, which is the work that's completed. So this slide really summarizes the content of the Notice of Lead Hazard Reduction activities. It does need to be provided within 15 days of completion of the work. There are a number of required elements that do need to be in that. A couple things to highlight: what was done, the type of treatment that was done, a contact. The contractor's name, information, contact information where they can get more information if they have questions, and then locations of any remaining lead-based paint and surfaces. So here's a sample of the Notice of Lead Hazard Reduction activities form. The sample includes all the regulatory requirements to be given to the residents. You can create your own form. You can change the format, but you cannot delete the required items. So you do want to make sure that you do have all the required items. We have them listed here. It's already put into a form for you that you can use. We have the link here, and then I've also put in the chat how to get to the toolkit, because this is going right off of the toolkit for you. And again, as we mentioned, it does need to be provided within 15 days of completion of the work of achieving clearance. So here's a reminder of that documentation that's needed for our notification step. Once that work is done, you want to have a copy of the Notice of Lead Hazard Reduction activities in there. You're going to check that for all the required elements, make sure there's dates and signatures. And then now that something has changed, we do need to make sure the owner is providing an updated disclosure notice to that tenant at lease renewal. So we want to check that to make sure it has, again, that it's been dated before the signing of the lease renewal, that there's signatures, that there's copies of reports that have been provided. So this is the notification that's done during the step of after the treatment has been done. But we also have notification. See if I can find our summary here. We do have notification when we did our evaluation. So when we did our risk assessment, we would have been providing a notice of evaluation. Visual assessment's not actually really considered it doesn't have an evaluation form that goes with it, but we did provide you a sample. You want to make sure that's documented and that information is provided to the tenants. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about ongoing maintenance and when periodic reevaluation is triggered. This is required unless all the lead-based paint has been removed. If the lead-based paint was just treated and was not completely removed, then the unit needs to be maintained to be lead safe. And it is subject to ongoing maintenance, and it may be subject to periodic reevaluation depending on which side of the chart your project will fall on. But keep in mind, lead-based paint maintenance is not required when a lead-based paint inspection report indicates that there's no lead-based paint on the property, or if a lead-based paint clearance report indicates that all the lead-based paint has been removed. So in order for ongoing lead-safe maintenance to be required, we are assuming there is still lead in the unit. It's been treated properly, but it still remains in the unit, and we want to make sure that it's safely in the unit. So this slide really shows the ongoing responsibility of ongoing maintenance and ongoing monitoring. So in general, ongoing maintenance is about how to keep that unit lead safe. So like we said, there is remaining lead-based paint, but we need to make sure that there's inspections that are going on. Those inspections are going to be unit turnover or every 12 months, whichever sooner, checking for any deteriorated paint. Disclosures are going to be issued to new tenants when they sign a new lease. If there's any new information, new disclosure notices are provided at lease renewal. Want to make sure all those records are being maintained. Want copies of when the inspections are being completed to make sure so that's being documented. Any work that's been done, those records need to be maintained as well. If there was any deteriorated paint identified by those inspections, they need to be treated using paint stabilization. Again, this is during the ongoing maintenance period, unless it was tested to determine it wasn't lead-based paint. If there was any bare soil, that needs to be treated with interim controls, such as plants or shrubs or grass, or if it's soil and you want to do more of an abatement method, that could be concrete. All safe work practices need to be followed when performing any maintenance or renovation work that disturbs lead-based paint. We want to make sure we're using properly trained RRP renovators. And if it's determined properly trained renovators and then ongoing maintenance, doing any type of repair that disturbs a surface that's above de minimis. Remember, de minimis was 2 square feet on the interior, 10% of a small component type, or 20 square feet for an exterior work. And then if for some reason abatement was done and there are enclosures or encapsulations, we'd also want to be checking to make sure none of those have failed as well. So this first slide is talking about if you have project-based assistance that's less than $5,000 per unit per year, what the requirements are. Again, this is required when there's still lead-based paint in the unit. We're trying to keep that unit lead safe. And so when we talk about lead safe, we're talking about no deteriorated paint or failed hazard control methods. So who's responsible for this? This is the owner that's going to be doing this. They are going to be doing a visual assessment, and that visual assessment is at unit turnover or every 12 months, whichever sooner. They've been trained as a visual assessor, so they took that free online training course that's available by HUD. They have a copy of that certification. They printed it out and stuck it in their files. So we have a trained visual assessor on staff who's going to be doing those visual assessments at unit turnover every 12 months. If they identify any new or deteriorated paint during that visual assessment, it is going to be stabilized. using RRP, people who are trained in RRP. We're going to get clearance of the unit. And then we're going to repair any failure of abatement methods. And then written notice, we talked about this earlier, but written notice asking the residents to report any deteriorated paint and any failure of encapsulations or enclosures. So this is what's required for our project-based assistance less than and equal to $5,000 per unit per year. Okay, and then we have a little different requirements for the other side of that chart when it's greater than $5,000 per unit per year. So we do have an annual assessment. It's either a visual assessment or a risk assessment, depending on the year that it has to be conducted, looking for failure of lead hazard reduction work or defective paint. That visual assessment is required annually or at unit turnover, and then we have this new term, periodic reevaluation. And so periodic reevaluation has to be conducted within 2 years of any hazard reduction activity and repeated 2 years later. So this ends after 2 consecutive reevaluations without finding any additional lead-based paint hazards or failed enclosures or encapsulations. So I think looking at this side of the slide always makes it really clear for me. So we'll see, you know, the first year after our work was done, we are doing a visual assessment. Again, somebody who can be trained as a visual assessor. The second year after the work is done, a risk assessment needs to take place. And so the owner needs to hire a risk assessor to be able to do that risk assessment. And after the risk assessment was done, if there was no identified hazards, then in year 3, we can go back to the visual assessment. And again, that can be someone who's just trained in that visual assessment training. And then year 4, we have to hire a risk assessor again. And so the risk assessment is done by a certified risk assessor. If no hazards have been found in year 2 or in year 4, then we don't need to continue risk assessments anymore. We can continue with just our regular visual assessments for the remainder of the time that we have this ongoing relationship. So that's the schedule of what you're doing. It's either a visual assessment or a risk assessment. And, you know, looking over here, who's doing it? It's the owner. Again, they're hiring a risk assessment or they're conducting the visual assessment depending on that year. If any deteriorated paint was identified, it would need to be done by someone trained in RRP. If we did find deteriorated paint, we would need to continue those risk assessments. We can't stop the risk assessments after year 4. That's only allowed if you do not see any additional hazards. And that visual assessment, again, is that unit turnover and every 12 months, whichever is sooner. Again, these ongoing maintenance and periodic reevaluations are only required when lead is still in the unit. It's not required if the lead-based paint was removed completely. So here's a reminder of that documentation for ongoing maintenance. You'd have a report of any new evaluations that are done, either your visual assessments or your risk assessments, a report of any new lead hazard reduction work that was done, clearance. You'd have a copy of your clearance report. You'd have certification copies of anyone who's doing any work. So the risk assessor, we want to have a copy of their certification. If we have to have work done, we'd have copies of our RRP. Renovators, we'd have copies of that documentation. The person who did the clearance, was it a risk assessor or a lead inspector or a clearance technician, we'd have copies of all that certifications. And then an updated disclosure notice, we'd have a copy of that in the file as well. All right, now we're going to do a very high-level review of the Lead Safe Housing Rule Amendment from 2017, which addresses elevated blood lead levels and the responses when there's a child in our HUD-assisted units. So EBLL stands for Elevated Blood Lead Level Response. This is a very high level. I think I have 3 slides to talk about this. Les and I just did training on this right before the holidays. So if you aren't really sure about EBLL and the responses to that, there was a training that was done. It was project-based assistance and public housing together in a webinar. And so you can go and look on the HUD Exchange, and we have some links in a couple slides too on how to get to those materials. So elevated blood level, that's what EBLL stands for. Once a child has been reported with an EBLL, there are a number of steps that need to be carried out, and there is a really tight timeline of when these things need to happen. There's a verification that's verifying if you did not hear directly from a medical provider or a health department, if like the mom called you, we need to be able to verify that the elevated blood level child, that it really is true. And then an environmental investigation needs to take place. And an environmental investigation is a risk assessment with a number of additional items that need to be done. It includes an interview of the family. It includes reviewing other areas that the child may spend during their day. Perhaps they're at a preschool, perhaps they're at grandma's house. So it's more than just the unit where the child lives. An environmental investigation is trying to discover the source of where the lead is coming from that has caused this child to have an elevated blood level. If the child living in your project, if it's determined that the unit has caused this elevated blood level, then all of the other coverage units in that property that have a child under 6 residing in those units will need to have a risk assessment. So we've been talking a lot early on about why it's really important for the owner to know about the units that have children under 6 living in them. This is one of those reasons, because if an EBLL child's identified and it's determined that their unit is the source, then all of the other coverage units, those are units with children under 6 living in them, have to have risk assessments that take place on those units. We do have some guides and information. We have training. This goes right to the toolkit that you can click on this to get some more information about that. A couple key terms that we have. Index unit, this is the unit where the child with the elevated blood level is residing. We have our other coverage units. These are the other units that are federally assisted in your project-based property where a child under 6 is living or is expected to live. And then we have our designated party. We did talk about designated party earlier on in the session. For project-based assistance, the designated party is the owner, okay, and they are responsible for complying with the applicable requirements. So this chart really summarizes about a 3-hour training. So I'm going to go again really high level over the steps. Please go to the training if you haven't been there already. The project-based response for elevated blood levels is found at 24 CFR 35.730. So if you're like me, where you need resources, but you got to read it in the regs and you just got to look at a lot of things, you can go to 24 CFR 35.730, and that's where you're going to find the project-based assistance response for elevated blood levels. So first we start off with our verification. This needs to be done as soon as possible. So if the mom calls and says, oh, I just came back from the doctor and my child has an elevated blood level, it needs to be verified. So that can be a phone call, it can be an email. If it's a phone call, it can be notes from that phone call, who you talked to, who the owner talked to. You'll see over here on the right-hand side who's responsible for doing these things. Those notes, a copy of the email, that can all be kept in the file. That needs to be done as soon as possible. The next step is initial notification of a confirmed case to HUD's Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes, also to the HUD field office, and if the health department did not notify, the owner, then the public health department also needs to be notified. Now, I know that all these responsibilities are showing up as the owner, but sometimes owners don't know how to get in contact with these different entities, so the program office may need to assist in that. After we have initial notification, we need to be doing environmental investigation. The public health department, if they have the capacity to do this, they can do the environmental investigation for the owner. If the health department is not going to do that, then a risk assessor needs to be hired and they can do the environmental investigation. That needs to be done within 15 calendar days after verification. You're going to start to see that some of the timing is business days and some of the timing is calendar days. So it's just important to pay attention to which type of day timeline needs to be followed. And this is straight out of the regulations. So the next one is notification to residents. So if we do the environmental investigation, a notice of evaluation is then provided to the family in the index unit. That's the unit that the child with the elevated blood level is residing in. And we also need to be providing notification to the other residents. And so we can say there's been a child with an EBLL found in the property. We're not going to give out the name. We're not going to give out any medical information, but we're going to notify them to let them know that and let them know what the next steps are. We've identified an elevated blood level child in the property. The unit has caused this situation. We are now going to be doing risk assessments we're going to do risk assessments on the other coverage units. If for some reason it's identified that the unit the child is living in is not the cause of them having an EBLL, maybe it's at the preschool, maybe it was at grandma's house, that ends the responsibilities. After that notification, there is no additional responsibility that's required through the Lead Safe Housing Rule. The owner might want to connect that family to the health department, but there is no ongoing requirement. If it's decided that the index unit was the cause of the EBL, then we have all these other things that need to happen. So lead hazard control needs to happen on the index unit. That can be interim controls or it can be abatement. It is up to the owner to decide what they want to do, and that needs to be done within 30 calendar days after the environmental investigation result has happened. At the same time, we're doing risk assessments and lead hazard control on the other coverage units. That needs to be done within 30 to 60 calendar days. Clearance has to be achieved after the work is completed, and the amount of time really depends on how many other coverage units are in the property. There's a little footnote down here that you can see. It depends on is there more than 20 other coverage units, less than 20 other coverage units. The HUD guidelines, that's a resource document that Les talked about. I think we have a picture of it later on at the end of our session here. Chapter 16 of the HUD guidelines provides a lot of detailed information about environmental investigations and sample sizes and that type of thing. So check that out as well. We need to be providing notification of clearance, 10 business days to the HUD field office, 15 calendar days to the residents, also notifying the HUD field office when all the activities are complete, and then we move back into ongoing maintenance. All right, there are a number of elevated blood level children resources that are available to you. We have trainings that I said that we had done recently. Those are available. The videos that we finished a couple months ago, really excited about those. This video is showing the family interview. So the family interview is part of an environmental investigation. The woman on the left is an actual risk assessor, and then we have a mom. And so you can see the video. It's 8 or 9 minutes, but it's really helpful. It goes through what the different steps are. If you're not familiar with that, I highly recommend that you check that out. And then we also have the toolkit and a lot of other a lot of other guidance and forms, sample forms that are available to you. So documentation, what are we going to be doing? So verification of the child with EBL. Remember, this could be the email, it could be notes from a phone call, a copy of the environmental investigation report. We would want to have copies of notification to the residents of the eligibility level child, copy of the risk assessment report, copy of the clearance report once work has been completed, certification of all those personnel who've done the work, certification of who did the risk assessment, the environmental investigation, certification, assuming it's the same person who does all those risk assessments, certification of the people who do the work, certification of the person who does the clearance. So we need all of that. And then again, the notification of lead hazard reduction activities. And so here's that module in the toolkit that can help walk you through that as well. So Les, is there any questions about EBLL or telling the type of notifications that have come up?
Well, I think we've only got one unanswered question here, and I have asked our HUD folks to take a look at that one. So I'm going to suggest we do these two last sections, and then we can kind of come back to the Q&A on that. So there we go. I'm center. Turn my camera on. All right. So what we're going to do with the remaining time here, we want to first talk a little bit about, so as you've listened to this list of requirements and you're thinking through, we want to talk a little bit about sort of next steps, planning, what your responsibilities might be, and kind of thinking about how do I make sure I'm ready for that. And then we also, as we promised, are going to go through some of these resources. We provided a lot of links along the way, but we want to go back through those and kind of talk about where they're all posted together and how they might be useful for you. So I want to start with talking about a little bit about program oversight, administration, monitoring on this. So some of the key areas to be thinking about, which probably a lot of you are kind of pondering as we go through, is thinking about, okay, so based on these requirements, who do I need to have, what kind of skill sets need to be in place, and do I have the staff in place? Will they be something, and depending on what your role is, you might be the agency that is providing the project-based assistance, or you might be a property manager who's going to be implementing this on behalf of the owner. And so thinking about, if I'm going to be doing a visual assessment, will that be agency staff? Will that be property or owners? Responsibility on that, and do we have somebody that already has that training and certification, or do I need to figure out who that will be and make sure that's in place? We've been talking about, in the case where you are going to be at above $5,000 in assistance, average assistance per unit per year, that we then have the requirement of a risk assessment being done. And so thinking about, is that going to be something that is going to be hired by the agency that needs to follow procurement requirements? And if that's the case, then we may want to have that done in advance. Chris talked about, the fact of needing to have, if we had a child with an elevated blood lead level, on needing to have an environmental investigation done. And so thinking about if that's going to be handled by someone that's triggering procurement requirements, and we've got this 15-day timeline to be able to complete that, probably that's something that you need to have lined up in advance. She mentioned that it may be that your health department actually is able to provide those services. So thinking about planning for each aspects of this on how that will be completed. We talked about the lead-safe work practices and trying to make sure that this is being done. So, first off, how do we make sure, how do we communicate those requirements? And that might be as part of language and agreements, but also pointing folks to available resources, making sure you and your staff are up to speed on that, and then thinking about that sort of oversight that would be created and making sure that those that are doing that are then going to be observing and making sure that what they see on site lines up with safe work practices, that if folks are saying, well, I'm exempt under the de minimis requirements, that they are following that appropriately. So kind of thinking about how do I put these things into place. We spent some amount of time talking about planning, particularly where we might have relocation. So thinking about what's the scope. I think, not only of, okay, once we've completed our evaluation process and determined what treatment needed to be done, I think hand in hand with that would need to be, okay, based on the treatment that needs to be done, I need to plan for what needs to happen here. With this scope of work that's being completed on this unit, can that tenant remain in place while that's being done, or do we need to plan for relocation as part of that? So thinking about that process, what your options are on that, and kind of having a plan of action, having identified how that might work and who would be involved in that. And then we always have this oversight responsibility, whether you are the owner of a property and you're working with your property manager to make sure the way you are handling the day-to-day requirements, completing things like the annual visual assessment, doing the visual assessment at turnover, the disclosures that we've talked about, versus when our visual assessment or our risk assessment identifies that there are treatment that needs to be completed. Thinking about how do we make sure that that is happening, and so the owner has a responsibility, but also if you are funding that project-based assistance, having a plan for your oversight on that, having a plan to make sure that the proper documentation is being collected on that. So as part of this, I think a lot of folks will be thinking about, are some of these functions going to be completed internally by my own staff? Will they be completed by a subrecipient or owner? Will they be something that we would contract out? And so thinking about how will we have that capacity, internal versus external, going through that process if we are going to trigger federal procurement, doing it in advance so that we will have that capacity available to us when we need that. And of course, we talked about if we're going through an RFP or RFQ, request for proposal or request for qualification process, that you would call out properly, okay, so if I need a risk assessor, here's the standard for what I need this bidder to be able to document as part of that. So we talked about visual assessments, risk assessments, clearance testing, thinking about things as simple as who is responsible for delivering notices? Do they know the timeline? Do we have a protocol so they know when the report has been received from the risk assessment so that we can make sure that we're within those 15-day notices? So it's that process of kind of planning for implementation, thinking about staffing, timing, process, any forms that you're going to use, and that's where some of these resources that we will be highlighting again might be important as part of that process. So we do need to have owners and property managers understand what their role is in this, what those requirements are, the standards that need to be in place, not only to make sure that contractors have appropriate certification, but that as part of processing any contractor invoices, that we can document that they have completed things to the standards that were required, that we have the third-party clearance has been achieved before payments are being made. So thinking about how those standards and those procedures will be completed and the safeguards on that. We've been pointing out kind of along the way some of these videos I think may be helpful for folks as a reference point to help walk folks through what it is that is required on this. I will also mention in Chapter 24 of the Monitoring Handbook, there is a checklist specific to the Lead Safe Housing Rule, and so you'd be able to think about in planning on what needs to be in place and making sure that your protocols and systems are up to speed to make sure that would all be covered. So as far as documentation on this, talked about right at the start that our target on this are assisted housing units that are pre-1978. So I think first off, we need to be able to identify for our assisted units, are they exempt because they are 1978 or recent, or are they pre-1978 units that are going to trigger the lead safe housing rule? So if this property is exempt for one reason or another, we would have that documentation. Otherwise, then we're going to be showing that we followed all the lead safe housing requirements under this subpart for the project. So that includes our disclosure requirements, the evaluation, any treatment reduction work that's being done, the notices that go along with that. And so making sure that all that stream of certification and other documentation is being collected to be able to document that. So we have some resources here. You'll see the second bullet point is specific to project-based assistance that is, I think this should be more than $5,000 per unit. The first one is under $5,000. So these have been fine-tuned to what the subpart is requiring as far as documentation. That would be a good way to set up your files and thinking about what do I need to expect to see in that file based on this, what it's triggering under this subpart. And so that might be a resource for you on planning for the documentation and communicating that to other parties on that. All right, so that kind of takes us through the portion on kind of thinking about planning, being ready for this. We're going to finish out here by talking about a little bit more, visiting some of these available resources. So the sort of go-to spot for this on the HUD Exchange, there is a landing page for everything lead-based paint. And so at the bottom of the slide is the direct link for this. And then each of the resources that we're going to be talking about for the rest of this section, I think almost all of them would be found at this page. So this is the landing page itself, and then let's look at some of these key things that we've talked about. So Chris has mentioned about the toolkit, which has been recently updated and posted. And so there are toolkits specific to the subpart that you'll be working with, but also, as Chris mentioned, there's a whole section on dealing with when you have a child with an elevated blood lead level. And so you'll see as you go down this column here that, here's a subpart K for acquisition. We're talking today about subpart H, which is project-based assistance. So tools that have been identified that are applicable to subpart H are found in this section of the toolbox. And as we mentioned, a lot of these are forms and things which would help you to have the appropriate documentation in the file. Those are for you to be able to use. You may, in some cases, want to customize them a little bit for how your process works, but these are all resources for you so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of things that you'll be able to use here. Also, we've been kind of pointing out as we went along about some of these newly released videos, which I think will be helpful to you and your staff, but also some of those partners for them to understand what is it that we're talking about when a lead paint inspection is being done, or if we're going through the interview process and we're working with a child with an elevated blood lead level or clearance testing. Each of these are highlighted within these newly created videos. I think they would be an important resource, but also might be really helpful in trying to help bring some of those other partners up to speed on that. So I would just recommend that you take a look at that. We also have mentioned a couple of points here about the HUD guidelines. So we just have been calling the HUD guidelines, but it's guidelines for the evaluation and control of lead-based paint hazards in housing. And so it's a technical manual, and it's really where it goes into further detail on each of these topics. So if you were trying to learn more about, sampling for evaluation on this, or for clearance testing, or whatever the case would be, this manual is really where you would go to get the most level of detail on this. And I can't recommend this highly enough, and I think this is something people use on an ongoing basis, not just sort of once looking at it, that you refer back to it as part of that. So for those of you that might not be familiar with most of this, we are talking about being on the HUD exchange. And so if you're not already a subscriber to the HUD exchange, I would encourage you to sign up. But it allows you then to set up preferences. So you'll notice over here we're talking about clicking on and updating your preferences. So what this is doing is saying anytime there's news about any of these particular topics, I want to get an email that will tell me about that. So anytime HUD is launching new training or guidance, or there's a new tool that's released, you would be notified of that. And I think you'll receive a link which will tell you about some new resource. I think that's really helpful on being able to get up to speed on this, stay current on that. So I would encourage you to not only get signed up on the HUD exchange, but also make sure that the Lead Safe Housing Rule is one of the things that you've included as one of your preferences on this. So here's a more traditional sort of list of resources here. So where to find the lead regulations, trainings specific to this. We've mentioned quite a bit about the EPA, and so that's listed here. We mentioned that the interpretive guidance is sort of topic by topic and goes into further detail. And I think you'll find that very useful as part of that. Here's our main linkage for the landing page for the lead safe paint on the HUD exchange, the toolkit that we just were talking about, the videos. And then I will mention there's a PIA to public housing notice that is specific to lead that would encourage folks to refer to. And I know at least in one case on the Q&A there was some reference to, if you provide us additional information and touch base back with HUD's Office of Lead Safe Housing. And so this bottom reference here, so we're going to be trying to answer any questions today, and we have an office hour session tomorrow. But I would encourage you to hold on to this email address. So when you're seeking additional information, this is the email to be able to contact HUD's Office of Healthy Homes, and they would be able to assist you on your sort of detailed program-specific questions on that. I think with that, that gets us through our slides. Chris, are there any questions you want to circle back? I suppose we should first remind folks that we will have a office hour tomorrow, and we will start by going through the exercise. So we really encourage folks to utilize the exercise that was included in the link for the materials that was sent to you, and spend a little time with that, prepare in advance of tomorrow's session. And this is sort of a way to be able to test that you've absorbed the key points here and are ready to be able to move forward in compliance with this. Chris, things we want to circle back to?
Yeah, there was someone had written in when we were talking about ongoing maintenance and having to do the visual assessments and the risk assessments, and they were saying that they were pretty sure that their property had all the lead removed, and if that was the case, do they still need to do the visual assessments or the risk assessment? So if the facility has a certificate that it's lead-free, then you don't need to do that ongoing maintenance. And it also requires that backup documentation supporting the lead-free determination be kept on file for both audit and monitoring purposes. So you do want to make sure you have that documentation on there.
And it seems like if they can't find that, it might be worth having it done again, just because that then exempts them from this ongoing responsibility.
I don't see any other new questions. I know we mentioned some of them that already come in.
And I don't know, I don't know if the HUD folks got a chance to look at there was a question specifically about the calculation.
That had been answered earlier,
okay.
Where they said it was $5,000 per unit in assistance, because somebody was asking, what's the $5,000 per unit? Is it lead work? Is it general repairs? And when we're talking about project-based assistance, we're talking about the amount of funding for the project-based assistance, $5,000 per unit per year, or more than $5,000 per unit per year, less than and equal to or more than, to try to determine what category you fall into. Les, I don't know if you want to bring up the summary chart.
Yeah.
Because that's what we've been trying to reinforce. It depends on which category, the left side of the chart or the right side of the chart, you fall in, to then determine what type of evaluation do you need to do, what type of treatment, what kind of ongoing maintenance. Like, those are the areas that are different depending on whether you're up to $5,000 per unit per year or over $5,000 per unit per year. So that's
the way I read this person's question. They had money in one unit, but it sounded like there were 4 units in the property. And I think what they were thinking was that they would be averaging it across all units as opposed to just their assisted units.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce had mentioned that it applies to the more than $5,000 per unit per year. Bruce, I don't know if you're still available to expand on that at all.
I am. I'm also looking at the de-leaded question.
Mm-hmm.
So the more than $5,000 per unit, inadvertently maybe not paying fully attention, that goes to the annual amount of per unit per year subsidy, and it applies to the assisted units.
Yeah. So they're not averaging it across all units in the property.
No.
Yeah.
No, just the assisted units. So you could have a 100-unit property, and 25 units are project-based rental assistance, and 75 units are market rate. And so the assistance would be of the assisted units. So if those assisted units receive more than $5,000 per year in assistance, then the right side of this chart would apply. And that could change, believe it or not, because as people's incomes go up, the amount of subsidy that's received so that they're only paying 30% of their income would change. So it can get complicated when you're on that edge. Very few properties currently still have the less than $5,000, but the visual assessment's required for everybody for as long as you have lead paint.
Okay.
And then the second question I was just starting to answer, the concern with de-leading. The definition of de-leading, and that is a specific term of art in the state of Massachusetts. It is a requirement that units occupied by a child under 6 are de-leaded from, I believe, if I remember, it's been a while since I've looked, but from 5 foot down, but you could still have lead, but you will have reached the Massachusetts Certificate of Conformance, the Certificate of De-leading, but you still may have lead-based paint, and so you need to follow your state regulations, which might be more protective than the federal regulations under Subpart H. But if, under Subpart H, if you had done the risk assessment, you twice found that you had, in reevaluations, had no lead hazards, then the visual assessment and complying with your local state requirements would be sufficient.
Great, thank you.
And I'd like to also add, if you have further questions on that one, feel free to drop us a line at leadregulations@hud.gov.
Great, thanks, Bruce. That's really helpful. Someone had also asked if there were anything that covered the amendment changes. That's the EBLL responses from 2017. They had a little technical issues. We did cover that. We only had a couple slides, so there wasn't a lot of time covered on that, but this session is being recorded, so when it's posted, you can go back and listen to that, or you can, if you need more information, you can go to the landing page and get to the trainings, and we have the either 2 or 2.5 hour webinar on the amendment, which was 2017 amendment about elevated blood level children. So if you've been to any of the EBLL trainings, the information has not changed. We just did a redelivery of the same material. So the material hasn't changed, but there were a lot of people that wanted a refresher or weren't hired at the time. We know there's a lot of turnover sometimes in housing and just wanted to know a little more about that.
All right, so we're kind of at the end of our time. Just remind folks, we will have our office hour tomorrow, and we encourage you to look at the exercise in advance. And we'll go through that and answer any further questions, probably revisit a couple of these things tomorrow. So thanks, everybody. Hope this was helpful, and hope you'll join us tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.